Hi, everybody. This is Miss Amber, and I'm here for your English 12A live lesson for today. So good news, if you're here, congratulations. This is the last and final lesson for English 12A. So this lesson is on Neoclassicism 2. It's the follow-up to Neoclassicism 1, and it gives us a little more information about what society was like in the 18th century and how the neoclassicism movement changed towards the end of the century. If you remember from the last lesson, neoclassicism spanned, I believe, like 2 centuries. It was a very long time. So the neoclassicism movement for writing at the beginning was very different than at the end. So now we're going to cover some of how it is at the end. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Move myself all the way up out of the way. So we're getting started here on slide number 5, just jumping right in because there's a lot to cover. So this section starts off with giving you information about culture and society in the 18th century, which if you remember how we go between centuries and years, is you take the number next to century, which would be 18th here. You subtract 1, that'll give us 17, and then you add double zeros. So we're talking the 1700s here. So we've got the rise of Parliament. That means this is when Parliament was implemented and became more powerful than it was before. And most notably, the emerging power of the Prime Minister and House of Commons. So this first slide just gives you a little summary of what it is we'll be going over here. It says these political changes reflected a broader, that means a larger, wider change in British society. Noble bloodlines were becoming less important. British success overseas created a wealthy merchant class and a thriving middle class. So merchants are people who sell things. In many societies, people who run businesses and sell things are in a different class than just typical people who have jobs servicing the community that make a lot of money. So in some cases, wealthy merchants had more money than noble families, and 2 important forces driving cultural change were population growth and the publishing industry. So if we go over to slide 6, we get started with in-depth information about this. So the first section here is about the population explosion. Great Britain's population doubled between 1721 and 1820. So that's in 100 years. So it grew from 7.1 to 14.2 million. And remember, when we're taking notes, when there are dates and numbers, you want to make sure you have those down. Those are the hardest types of information to remember: numbers, dates, statistics, years, that kind of thing. So you want to make sure that you've got at least a little something about this in your notes. By 1820, it says the average family size had reached 6 children per family, and that's the highest rate in British history. So they're explaining to you with an example the difference between maybe like families now and how they were at this time. The average, that means most people had 6 children per family. So we get a little more information here. Land reforms of the agricultural revolution made many farmers landless. Now, if you remember, once they started with the Industrial Revolution, a lot of people stopped paying everyday people to take care of their land. And also a lot of businesses bought up land and basically made machines to tend and take care of that land instead of passing it on to other people or selling it. And people were also using that land to build factories and that kind of thing. So a lot of farmers were misplaced, moved away from their traditional work. And because there were so many factories that needed bodies to do more work, that is where most of the farmers ended up. So they say these ex-farmers flooded the cities as access labor, feeding the early development of Europe's first modern factories. So they do think, scholars, people who study this, argue that the 18th century population boom helped Great Britain become the first industrialized nation because there were so many children that were being had by families at the time. There were a lot of people, a lot of adults growing up in these families to work in these factories without having to accept a lot of immigrants or other travelers. So it says here, though industrialization brought pollution, unequal gains, and market volatility, it also led to an increased standard of living for many workers. So just to break down a couple of the words here, industrialization is the process of like streamlining how you make something. So factory work where one person does just one thing all day and another person does a different thing all day in steps to create something. That's kind of the factory mindset. Now, assembly lines in that way weren't popular until some innovation in America. But the idea of everyone working in a factory to produce one item is basically what made factories popular. And that's what they mean by industrialization here, being able to use technology to make things. And then here we have volatility. That means unpredictable. If something is uncontrollable and unpredictable, it's volatile. So when they say market volatility, what they're saying is the market became a little more unpredictable because it depended on what people made, how much was being bought. They were adjusting to something a little closer to the supply demand system numbers that we have now. So it says that meant for the British population, particularly the middle and upper classes, they had more leisure time than ever before. So what they're saying here is industrialization did make a lot of things worrying for British citizens, but also with that technology came better medical technology as well. And with better medical technology, people were able to live longer, even if they weren't in these even if they were not in good conditions. So the middle and upper classes that had more money owned and were hanging on to land and own these factories, they had more leisure time. And the reason why they're telling you this is because the next section is on the print explosion. They figured out how to make a machine that did printing, and they kind of like fine-tuned it to produce more and more books. So there was a publishing boom. Literacy rates were going up because everyone was making more money. And also driven by the Protestants wanting everyone to be able to read the Bible. If you remember from the last lesson, maybe a couple lessons ago, the Protestant Christian church broke away from the Catholic Church. And one of the things that they wanted to do was have the Bible translated to English, which it was, and they wanted everyone to know English so that they could read it for themselves instead of having someone from the Catholic Church have to translate Latin for them because they were worried about corruption within the Catholic Church and people just being able to translate things to mean whatever they want to be convenient. So this kind of all happened at the same time and was ramping up into one another. I've said this on a couple other lessons before, but history does not happen in a vacuum. So there's a lot of things that happen at the same time, and those things influence each other. So people reading English more meant that people wanted more things to read. And the publishing boom happened at a time where the technology made it easier for people to print books. So the combination between more people being able to read, more people wanting to read, meant that there was a demand for books. And the fact that the upper classes had more free time, they had more time to read books. Additionally, it says here, the merchant and middle classes provided a demand for literature. That's what we said. They were highly literate, they had money, and they had free time. Exactly. Now, this video is about Jonathan Swift, and he's discussing writing being illegal. So Jonathan Swift is known for being very much into satire. So that's pretty much when you parody something to make fun of it and show how ridiculous it is. So this video It's only 2 minutes long, so it's not that long. It tells you about the rise of the printing press, and it tells you about the 1689 English Bill of Rights, which allows the freedom of the press. Remember, we're talking changes that are happening in Britain, so they have their own Bill of Rights and laws over there that's separate from the US and how that developed. So take a moment to pause this video, go to your lesson and watch this one, and then come back here when you're ready and we'll move on, okay? Alrighty, assuming that you pause to watch the video, we're going to skip over to slide 10 and continue. So here, we've got information about how things changed in terms of printing. So this says language change and grammar text. So because there was so much printed material, people wanted to have standards that everyone who's printing things can go by. That means it would save costs because everything will be printed the same way without machines having to be made differently or adjusted for different works. And then on top of that, they implemented some things with grammar. And it says here, writers curbed their use of italics and limited capitalization to the initial letter of proper nouns and at the start of sentences. And these changes made publishing less complicated and less expensive. So if you've seen in your history courses or even just online, if you're watching like a documentary of like historical documents and stuff like that, you'll notice that in older times, people would capitalize the words of pretty much anything that they felt was important. If it was an important word, they would capitalize it. And you can see that in older writing. If you take a look at the Constitution, there's a lot of different words that are capitalized a bit differently than we do now. So during this time, the Neoclassicism movement section, people made it so that capitals only went at the beginning of sentences and proper nouns. So if you're giving the name of a thing, it'll have a capital letter. And if you're starting a sentence, it'll have a capital letter. And they stopped people from just capitalizing whatever they wanted because it made it easier to print things. And then in the second paragraph here, it gives you information about another force behind standardizing things and making publishing the same. There were a lot of scholars that felt like the English language was changing too fast. Pretty much, Jonathan Swift, the guy from the previous video on slide 7, I believe, he was looking at older English texts and how different they were from the English that he was reading and writing during this time. And he didn't want his works to become so outdated that they were just as hard to read. Like if you've ever tried to read Shakespeare, you know that it's actually pretty hard to interpret it unless you actually study how to read those words. So Jonathan Swift had to do the same thing. And he wanted English to have a standard that everyone needed to follow so that he wouldn't have to worry about people needing to study to understand what he's writing. He didn't want his writing to be outdated in 100 years or stuffed in a history book where no one would pay attention to it because it's so old that people can't understand it anymore. So he wrote a paper called A Proposal for Correcting, Improving, and Ascertaining, that means understanding and deciding, the English tongue in a letter to the Most Honorable Robert Earl of Oxford and Mortimer, Lord High Treasurer of Great Britain. So he basically wrote this to talk about why there should be a standard for English and what he was worried about. Now on slide 11 here, we talk about this a little more because having simpler language that people could understand for many generations wasn't just the only concern. They were worried because of classism, looking down on the poor, that the English language would become weird and difficult if people who were not rich or that had the proper upbringing were speaking it. In other words, scholars were not only worried about language change, but also language deterioration. Like if you know people use slang, they shorten words, they add phrases to explain things what they feel is an easy way. And at this time, people were very classist and they felt like changing things or adding things uh, just degraded the language and made it not as fancy. So they wanted proper English so that there were rules for everyone to follow. This is where the idea of proper English actually started to take hold the way that we view it, like in the modern day. So Swift and some other people wanted to establish a language academy. Now, if you don't know what that is, a language academy is a government group that basically takes a look at the language that your country has and makes decisions about if they're going to allow in new words or phrases or if they want to make up their own to stay loyal to the rules of the language. Now, you may not have heard of a language academy before, but there are a lot of countries that still have them. One of the most well-known language academies is French, the French Language Academy. There is very specifically rules on how to get French words into the dictionary, and especially with technology changing, there was actually a really big controversy when the internet was becoming popular because there was no French word for email. So the Language Academy for France actually got together and they said, well, we don't want to borrow English words. We don't want to have English words in our language. We want our language to stay French for the French, by the French. So they came up with a word that basically just means electronic mail, putting other French words together. And they used that to mean email instead of using the actual word email. There is an Italian language academy, and some other countries have them too. So Jonathan Swift and some other people wanted to have something like this. They wanted to educate the public on what was proper and what wasn't, slow change, so basically reject things that they didn't want to add, and prevent deterioration, so stop basically poor people from speaking the language in a way that they didn't like. That's what the goal of that was supposed to and then they also suggested fining, that means charging money, authors for the creation of new words. And they decided not to do that, but they definitely wanted to make sure that change in the English language was slow. So this was one of the ideas that they threw out there. So as you can tell, because there's no language academy for England now, it never really caught on. People just felt like that was too controlling, and that freedom to create is part of what makes language genius. So they felt like people who spoke English weren't so crazy with how they use their language that they needed to be like the French or the Italians. So this is how we started on the path to the dictionaries that we use today. So instead of a language academy, we have dictionaries that give you a list of words and tell you what they mean and how to use them. And in some cases, they'll tell you where the word originated. So moving into this, we're going to start talking about Samuel Johnson, because he basically published the first authoritative, that means trustworthy, English dictionary. And he did that in 1755. So pretty much, he wanted to actually put that list together so that people could have a place to go to learn how to use words, how to spell them, all of those things. It says here, additionally, during that time, linguists, that means people who study language, started applying Latin rules to the English language. So the rules that we have for pluralizing nouns, that means talking about items that if there's more than one. So if you have the word apple, for example, you're pluralizing it because there's more than one. There's single, that's just one, and then there's plural, that's more than one. So if you're pluralizing nouns, that's something like windows, TVs, mice instead of mouse, right? So they set the rules and started applying Latin to some words. We do use Greek for others, but that's a separate point. And conjugating verbs. So conjugating is what tense you're using the word in. So what I mean by tense is the time that your verb refers to what's happening. So you can do things currently, like I am watching this video. The ing tells you that it's happening right now. But if you were to say, I watched this video, you're conjugating, that means changing the verb into past tense. So that ed tells us that it happened in the past. If you were to say something like, I will watch this video, right? You're conjugating for future tense. And future has like another verb attached to it. I will. That means that's what I'm going to do. And then watch. So they started applying those rules to words. And then it says grammar texts started joining the ever increasing mass of published materials. So they basically wanted to start having lists to keep track of things. That's pretty much what this whole debate started. Okay, so now we're looking into slide 15. Slide 15 is characteristics of 18th century literature. So they're letting you know what types of features writing in the 1700s was like what types of features they had. So the publishing boom resulted in the growth of magazines and journals, which featured works by some of the period's greatest writers. But a lot of them were philosophical and embodied Enlightenment thought. So if you remember from previous lessons, Enlightenment thought has a little more to do with being direct and talking about scientific things and trying to kind of pull away from a lot of religious talk in the writing. And then they give you an example. There's David Hume's 1741 essay on the liberty of the press, and John Locke's essay concerning human understanding. So they wanted to believe that man, like humans, was a rational thinking being. And this was very different from what had been going on before this at the time, because the Puritans were religious and they believed that people entered the world as an evil, flawed being. Enlightenment writers pushed past this and back on it and felt like everyone enters as a blank slate. And you show the world what kind of person you are with the decisions you make as you grow older and as you continue through life. So though prose, that means like story writing, was most common, poetry was still popular. The poetry of the 18th century abandoned the embellished, that means like fancy extra style of Milton's Paradise Lost from the previous lesson, in favor of a simpler, more balanced approach. And then it says Milton's complex blank verse was replaced with couplets. So couplets are when two lines can be coupled together with a rhyme at the end. So neoclassical writers of the 18th century were less influenced by Puritanism than previous generations. So here are some of the features. They rejected heavy subject matter and moral preaching, and instead wrote allegorical works, kind of like John Bunyan's The Pilgrim's Progress. So what they're saying here with the allegory, an allegory is a story that is supposed to represent a journey in life. So the story itself is a symbol for other things. And the long story short is that you were supposed to look at the story itself and find meaning, not just in what the story is about, but the characters and what they represent, as well as just the way that the story was put together altogether. It says here, even when 18th century writers addressed serious topics, their tone often remained lighthearted and optimistic, as opposed to the tone of Bunyan's The Pilgrim's Progress or Milton's Paradise Lost. So that whole everyone's born as a blank slate. So we all get to make our own, like make up who we are as our own person. They took that optimism and ran with that. So then they give you an excerpt here. You should definitely pause to read or listen if you're an auditory learner. It says here, the following excerpt from Alexander Pope's essay on man reflects the changed attitude and tone of 18th century work. So this is an example of how things are different from Paradise Lost in the previous lessons. So here on slide 17, we get a little more information about the novel. So this is where the novel began to pick up during this time. So a new literary form also gained popularity during the period of the novel. So this connects back to what we were saying earlier about merchants and other people who are wealthy having more time to read. So people wrote longer stories to entertain people who have more time to read. It says here, the birth of the novel is closely tied to the intellectual, that means in terms of thinking and knowledge, and social trends during this period, most notably the publishing boom, which increased the increased leisure time and higher literacy rates. So the middle and upper classes kept personal journals and wrote letters to friends and family. Travel diaries were also popular. So if someone went on a trip, they would write something once a day while they were gone. So the first novels were a combination of these forms. People used diaries and travel logs to tell stories. They were told in first person and from the point of view of a female character most of the time. Usually, women were the people who were reading. They were most of the people reading in the time period of the early novel because they had the most free time. Even if you were a wealthy man, you still had other matters to attend to in terms of your estate. You might have run a business. You had free time, but not quite as much free time as women tended to. So with the expanded British middle class came an increased number of educated women who were considered too wealthy to work, and novels targeted that segment of the British public. So there's a table that they've put here, opening it up, that just gives you characteristics of neoclassical literature. I will put this in your notes because it gives you a better idea and list of the different styles that are a part of neoclassical literature. So they pretty much tell you what the element here is. So we have common form, so that's the forms people wrote in. We have prose style, which is the storytelling style. Prose is storytelling. We have the poetic style. We have influences of the time and what this movement is a response to. And then they give you a list for each of these things so that you know exactly which are which and how they relate to the elements over here. So take a little time to write that down. You're definitely going to get a couple questions on the mastery test about the information here. Alrighty. We're going to skip over to slide 19. So then we're starting to get into some of the highlighted authors for the lesson. The first one is Daniel Defoe. So it says here, no author embodies the changing social hierarchy of the 18th century better than Daniel Defoe. Defoe's parents were members of the lower middle class. He attended school to be a minister, but ended up going into business selling woolen garments and wine. He spent most of his life in debt. So that's just a little about him. But more importantly, he wrote quite a few things. He wrote the pamphlet, The Shortest Way with Dissenters in 1702. Dissenters are people who are fighting against your cause. So that upset very many powerful people. And at this time, because the issue was about, the biggest issue in the country was about religion, dissenters referred to Christians who wished to separate from the Anglican Church. So remember, we had the Protestant Church, which is represented by the Anglican Church. So Anglican just means from England. So since Henry VIII separated his personal beliefs from the Catholic Church, that was part of the Anglican Church. So even after the English or Anglican Church and the Catholic Church were separated, there were people within the Anglican Church that still wanted to break off because they still didn't quite agree with everything the church was doing. So that pamphlet was considered critical of the Anglican Church. Daniel was defined. I'm sorry, Daniel Defoe was fined, and he was publicly denounced and sent to prison for that, actually. Because even though people had like freedom to write, they didn't have freedom to criticize the church. Defoe also had a habit of taking unpopular opinions and unnecessary risks. So he worked as a spy for the Tories. That's one of the political parties in Britain. And he even started a newspaper that reported on controversial issues. So he was just dedicated to publicizing things from the opposite of what people supported, mostly at the time. So it says the Whigs took Defoe to court for his opinions, and he ended up with a second prison sentence. So he's been in prison twice, at least, in his life. But in 1719, he started writing fiction, and he wrote novels which were popular at the time. So they give you the names of a few of them. So we've got The Life and Adventures of Robinson Crusoe, Captain Singleton, Journal of the Plague Year, Captain Jack Maw Flanders, and Roxana. Now here we're focusing on one of his works, which is The Life and Adventures of Robinson Crusoe. It was pretty much popular from the moment it was published. It was different from other novels at the time because it focused on a man of humble birth, so not a female character. At the time, a lot of novels were diaries or travel diaries of the rich and famous, but this was very different. Crusoe in the book was not a wealthy merchant. He was just an ordinary person who had extraordinary adventures. So that was very new at the time. It's something that we do every day here in modern times. We write about a regular person who gets swept off into another world or who discovers they have powers or something like that. But this was like one of the first stories to ever do that. So they talk about the style here. It reflects changing ideas about literature. So Defoe did away with, or he stopped doing, the ornate writing style. So ornate means fancy, of the 17th century. So he wrote in a simpler style so that everyone could understand. He also avoided the elegance of social appropriateness associated with the upper class. So he wrote about habits and behaviors that the middle class did, even if it was considered like rude or uncivilized to upper class people who might have read the book. And that approach became the new standard for the English novel because so many people were able to relate. Now on this slide, they give you the link here, read the excerpt from the first few pages of Robinson Crusoe. So feel free to stop the video, pause, give that a read, and then we'll be moving on to the next author. Alrighty. So here we are on a second author for this lesson, which is Alexander Pope. Pope and Defoe have some things in common. They were not a member of the privileged class, so they weren't wealthy. And in some circles, Alexander Pope was disliked even more than Defoe because his parents were Roman Catholic. And remember, there was a lot of back and forth about if the country was going to be a Catholic or a Protestant country, and the Protestants didn't like the Catholics and the Catholics didn't like the Protestants. So depending on who was king or queen at the time, people were sometimes imprisoned or attacked for being Catholic or Protestant. It depended on who was on the throne. So it says, as a Catholic, Pope was not allowed to attend university, vote, or hold public office. He was a sick child growing up, contracted a form of tuberculosis, and as an adult, he was only 4.5 feet tall. So he definitely died early at the time, at age 56, but he wrote a whole lot throughout his entire life. So his first success as a poet, because he is a poet, it was in 1711 with a poem called An Essay on Criticism. And then he also did a mock, that means like a parody, heroic epic The Rape of the Lock, which used to be referenced a lot by people in the boomer generation, although you don't hear as much about it now. So both of these works were written in heroic couplets, which is basically like a form where every two lines rhyme with each other, every set of two, and it has a very strong rhythm that you can follow along with. He became very famous, and he also helped with translating some older works that were well known, the Iliad and the Odyssey, which are like epic adventures. If you remember from the John Milton lesson, he wanted an English epic to be like those. So being able to accurately translate them, Pope was pretty popular for that. During his lifetime, Pope was famous for his witty satires and bitter spats with other writers. So he basically got into beef with other writers, and he was not afraid to criticize them in his own writing. It says the quintessential neoclassical poet. So they're saying he represents the majority. He's like the classic neoclassical poet. So when you think neoclassical poet, you should think Alexander Pope. That's what they're saying. His work was increasingly seen as outdated as the Romantic era took root in the 19th century. So he was definitely a neoclassical poet, and eventually his work fell out of style. And then they say it was not until the 1930s that serious attempts were made to rediscover his work. So he was very famous. He was able to do a lot. And then after he died and other things became more popular, people forgot about him, and then they rediscovered him. So we're going to talk a little bit about the Rape of the Lock. This is Pope's famous mock or pretend hero epic. So it is based on an actual event that happens in real life. Basically, there's a character called Belinda, and she was based on Arabella Fermor, who was a member of the Pope's circle of influential and wealthy Catholic friends. When a young man named Lord Peter, the Baron, who is in the poem, they cut off a lock of Arabella's hair. It started a rift between two prominent Catholic families. So it started beef between those families. So pretty much this event is the basis for his story. Pope's friend, John Carroll, suggested that the Pope were to write, that Alexander Pope write this poem to lighten the tension and encourage the two sides to reconcile. So the poem is addressed to Carroll. So basically, Alexander Pope's friend, John Carroll, was like, hey, I think if you write a funny story about this, it'll all blow over. So he pretty much wrote this so that everyone can have a laugh about how ridiculous the situation is and hopefully put the past behind them. That's pretty much it. Okay. So they want you to note the rhythmic quality of Pope's work. So going back to this slide here, if you have this read to you, or if you read it to yourself, you'll notice that while you're reading, you can sense the rhythm and kind of anticipate how these lines are going to be read. What dire offense from amorous causes springs? What mighty contests rise from trivial things? So we've got a rhythm there already. Excuse me. I sing this verse to Carol. Muse is due. This even Belinda may vouchsafe to be. So we have a rhythm here of the words. If you go through the whole thing, you can get a sense for how each line is going to sound. So a rhythm is something that you can follow. It's a pattern that repeats over and over. And he was very, very good at writing that. So they give you the definition of heroic couplet here. They mentioned it before, but the definition is couplets. So that's two lines that are paired together in iambic pentameter. So iambic pentameter is a line that has 10 syllables in it in a specific rhythm. So this form is deceptively simple. It takes a great deal of skill to find just the right words that also rhyme. And Pope was known for his precision in this. So he was really good at writing 10-syllable lines in that rhythm with rhyming words at the end. He was good at that. And then they give you a little more information about the Rape of the Lock. He uses a playful tone to criticize the incident of the lock of hair that led to such a big disagreement. It's full of parodies of epics, so he makes fun of other epic poems that he's copying off of, like the Iliad and England's own Paradise Lost. So he's basically making fun of the event by writing it as if it was this big historical important thing, even though it's not. There's an epic battle scene that happens during a game of cards between men and women. That's what they mean by battle of the sexes. There's also supernatural characters like the sylphs. And then they give you the definition of what that is. In a classic epic, the spirit of a former warrior might protect a hero in battle. So basically, imagine having your ancestors come to defend you and make sure you win like a game of cards. That's pretty much what we're looking at here. And he wrote this as if it was the most serious thing in the world to show everyone how silly this event was, to try to get everyone to sort of get over it. So here on slide 27, they give you the main characters in Rape of the Lock. So there's Belinda. She's the young heroine of the tale, so she's the main character. She's very beautiful and has thick, lush hair. We have the Baron. He's the young gentleman who wants to steal a lock of Belinda's hair. We have Ariel, who is Belinda's guardian sylph, and she oversees an army of invisible protective deities. And Clarissa is another socialite at the party with Belinda and the Baron, and she plays a pivotal role in how things go in the story. So they give you an excerpt from the Rape of the Lock for you to read, pause, and then meet me on slide 29, where we are going to look at our last author for this lesson. Now, I'm sure you're asking, why doesn't this lesson have like an analysis section? Well, there are sections that give you information about the text before you read, but also these are written in something a little closer to modern English. And because the stories are fairly simple, they don't really think it's necessary to do the analysis. If you are having trouble understanding it, of course, reach out to your advocate or your mentor and try to arrange tutoring. So we're going to hop over to 29. And our last author is someone who was already mentioned. We have Jonathan Swift. He was born in Dublin, Ireland, so he's Irish. His family was Anglican and not Catholic. So instead of being dissenters who are against the Anglican Church, his family was royalists. That's people who were loyal to the Anglican Church. He still was not a child of privilege. His father died before he was born. His mother left him with relatives because she couldn't take care of him. He was able to still get a good education, though. And after college, he wanted to pursue a career in the church. He became a secretary to a retired diplomat, and he ended up being able to study in a library there, and he fell in love with literature and decided to study at another university so that he could read and write. After he published his first poem, the famous writer, John Dryden, who was like a relative of his, told Swift that he would never be a poet. But he was able to improve his writing and become kind of famous. He was ordained by the Anglican Church, but he focused his attention on writing stories. He figured since he's not a great poet, he can still do writing of a different kind. So his first great work was A Tale of a Tub, and that was a satire on religious extremism. So remember, satire is when you are making some fun of something to prove a point or point out how bad or flawed something is. And Swift did this with almost all of his writings. He also wrote The Battle of the Books, which is another satire about a literary debate of the day. Both of these were published in 1704, but he also published lots of other satires. He wrote a lot of essays over the course of the early 18th century, but most people know him for Gulliver's Travels. So Gulliver's Travels was basically a story about a man who traveled to some fictional imaginary places that had some of the same problems that England had with his population. And he basically used that story as a satire to point out issues with how England was being run, who was at the top, and what sort of things they expected from people. He also wrote A Modest Proposal, which is still used today as a textbook example of satire characterized by contempt and sarcasm. So remember, not only is it just satire, A Modest Proposal was also a parody. So he basically wrote a fake suggestion, like an official suggestion for Parliament and the royalty to put something into law. And we'll get into a little bit of what it is later, but he writes about a ridiculous suggestion as if it was very serious and should be taken seriously. And he pretty much did that to point out how ridiculous some of the answers to questions and problems are that people in the upper class suggest for people of the lower class. So he did achieve fame during his lifetime, and a collection of his works was published in Dublin. He pretty much started having other health issues, and he passed away in 1745. So moving into A Modest Proposal, we'll go a little more in depth. So the full name, which most people will not actually publish because of how offensive it is, they call it A Modest Proposal, but the full text of the title is A Modest Proposal for Preventing the Children of Poor People from Being a Burden on their Parents or the Country, or for Making them Beneficial to the Public. And what he describes here, he suggests a horrific solution, and the solution that he suggests basically is that people eat their children. And he writes this as if it's a regular proposal that someone would submit to Parliament to show how ridiculous some politicians see when they present problems for the poor, or solutions to problems to the poor that won't actually fix the problem. It says here, his tone, even though he suggests such a horrific conclusion, remains as calm and rational as if he were proposing any normal public policy. So he was basically the most famous example and the best example of what to do when you are trying to pass off satire. A lot of people read his proposal and couldn't figure out, because of the way he wrote it, is he serious? Is he actually suggesting that people like eat their children? And the way that we have a lot of people doing parody and making fun of things in satire now, think of like The Onion, which does like sarcastic articles in a serious sort of way. Jonathan Swift, is sort of the pioneer for that, like the grandfather of people doing this, of writing ridiculous things as serious so that people can see how ridiculous other things that people actually are suggesting in real life are. So if you move over to 32, I think this is the last informational slide here. So from the start of the essay, the reader might think that Swift is about to introduce a real solution to the problem of Dublin's impoverished children. So what they're saying here is, in this excerpt here, he definitely writes the beginning. This excerpt here, it is a melancholy object to those who walk through this great town or travel in the country when they see the streets, the roads, and the cabin doors crowded with beggars of the female sex, followed by 3, 4, or 6 children, all in rags, and importuning every passenger for an alms. So basically asking for money. So he describes this very seriously in the beginning. This is an actual problem that Dublin was having. And because he describes it like this, you think he's going to actually give you like a real solution. But then the essay makes a turn. I've been assured by a very knowing American of my acquaintance in London that a young, healthy child, well nursed, is, at a year old, a most delicious, nourishing, and wholesome food, whether stewed, roasted, baked, or boiled. Now, obviously, he doesn't actually think people should eat children. But again, all of the suggestions that people keep making to help the poor are not actually things that help the poor. So he decided to write this as satire to make fun of those people who keep suggesting dumb things that don't actually help the situation. So as the essay progresses, Swift's views and proposals become more and more absurd. He elaborates on the topic for the rest of the essay, even going so far as to list reasons why his proposal is beneficial to Ireland's poor, the upper classes, merchants, cooks, and the whole of Ireland. So basically, he keeps up the guys, the joke, the mockery for the entire paper. The whole proposal is written as if it was actually a legal document to be submitted to Parliament or to lawmakers. And he does that all the way to the end. So the goal is for people to read it and say, that's crazy. And for him to turn around and say, yes, this is actually just as crazy as all these other things that people keep submitting. I'm glad that you can tell that this is ridiculous. I think that that is actually it for, yep, that's pretty much it. Yeah, so this wasn't that long of a lesson. I'll go ahead and stop sharing. So, I think that this is the last lesson for 12A. So this is just about literature that we got to see during the last part of Neoclassicism, especially because Jonathan Smith and his parodies are the backbone of what we consider parody today. Usually, if you're looking for an example of what satire is, people point to Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal. It's the best example. Most people can understand why it's absolutely ridiculous, and you can easily compare and contrast like why he would write it and put that out there. So yes, that's pretty much it for this lesson. Congratulations if you made it this far. You've finished the course. Now you just have your DBA, your discussion, and turning in your notes, and then you can take the final. So again, just as a reminder, if you have a hard time understanding any parts of the lesson, please feel free to reach out and book a session with a tutor. We've got some English tutors. We also can help you out with just understanding not just the lesson itself, but the text. If you don't know what certain words mean or you're having issues, looking things up is not working out for you, just let us know. But other than that, I think that is about it. Congratulations again on making it to the end of your English 12A course. And this is Miss Amber signing off. And good luck with your final and the rest of your English class.